Hi everyone, this is Jane. So today I'm going to be talking about something unconventional. We will be exploring if GDP actually tells us how our country is doing. Can GDP actually measure progress? So we'll use Malaysia as our lens to explore this topic by looking at the difference between real economic growth and the country's development as a whole, and also to look at how sustainability economics is able to help us to understand the gaps. Shall we? So, what is sustainability? Today, we hear this word a lot. And how does it apply to economics? So, sustainability means more than just protecting nature. It's about meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of tomorrow. It includes economic health, social equity, and environmental integrity. And in this presentation, we'll explore how economics, through subfields like environmental and green finance, can actually help us pursue growth that is fair, inclusive, and future-proof. So let's look at Malaysia's economic story. Recently, in 2024, Malaysia's GDP grew by 5.1%, and it is also projected to hit up to 5.5% in 2025, this year. So, and we can also see from the figures that inflation remains low at only 1.8% in 2024. So, on paper, that's great. But here's the catch. Are ordinary Malaysians better off with these figures? So, you can see that GDP doesn't show us the rising costs, housing pressures, or job insecurity. It's just a number. As Joseph Stiglitz once said, GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And that brings us to today's presentation. We are going to dive deeper with facts, figures, and news. So I am going to present my stand today. In my research, it shows that GDP does not equal to progress. And why do I say so? GDP tracks how much we produce and consume, but not whether that growth is inclusive or sustainable. For example, GDP may rise while income inequality grows, forests disappears, or public services decline. It also doesn't measure unpaid work, emotional well-being of the people, or environmental loss. So if we only look at GDP, we risk thinking that the economy is fine while people and the planet are actually suffering. As the famous Robert Kennedy once said, GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. This is true. So let's take a closer look at the catch-up index, a measure of how close a country's income per person is to the US level, adjusted for purchasing power. So you can see in 2022, Malaysia stood at just 45%, while Korea and Taiwan have surged to 80 and 85%. That's a dramatic difference. So despite steady GDP growth, Malaysia is not catching up at the same pace. This reflects structural challenges, including productivity, governance, and inclusion. We risk being stuck in a middle income trap if we do not transform our development model. And this is why we need to move beyond GDP in order to pursue convergence in quality of growth and not just quantity in numbers. Now let's look at Mexico or Mexico, a country that seems similar to Malaysia in so many ways. Unfortunately, it has geographic advantages, major trade deals like NAFTA, and a GDP per capita slightly higher than Malaysia's. But here's the catch. Mexico's catch-up index is just 16% as well. That means despite decades of growth, it's still far from high income status. And why is that so? Well, because of its structural issues like inequality, weak governance, and corruption. They hold the country's economic growth back. So GDP went up, but institutions did not catch up. Malaysia, with a similar CUI around 15%, risked the same trap. If we only chase numbers and ignore resilience, we might share Mexico's fate, stuck in a middle income trap, and GDP growth alone really isn't enough. We need inclusive policies and strong institutions to truly develop. And this is something that we can learn from high income countries and well developed countries, for example, like Korea. So, does economics still matter? Yes, it does. So, even if GDP by itself is insufficient, economics remains very essential to us because it offers us powerful tools to design or redesign better policies. From understanding externalities and inequalities, it helps us to guide sustainable use of resources. And economics help us to navigate complex trade-offs as well. So the goal is not to abandon economics or GDP even, but to evolve how we use it. So when we apply economics and GDP with a sustainability lens, it becomes a compass, not just to grow the economy, but also to improve lives, protect nature, biodiversity, and to build resilience. So have a look at this. Today, we are going to be talking about how we're going to use economics to build a better future through environmental economics, natural resource economics, sustainable development economics, and green finance that are applicable to our country, Malaysia. Now let's look at the real cost of growth. So as you can see, Malaysia's GDP has surged by nearly 438% since 1990. But the CO2 emissions have also risen almost just as much at 432%. And there's nearly a one-to-one link. In contrast, you can see that Singapore managed a 445% GDP increase with their CO2 emission at only 13%. That is an impressive gap. There's no wonder Singapore is doing so well. And that is the standard of decoupling growth from pollution. Meanwhile, let's look at Mexico. Despite being wealthier than Malaysia, follows a worrying path as well. Moderate growth, but continued emissions rise, helped by inequality and weak environmental governance. So this is the cautionary tale. Malaysia is growing, yes, but we are doing it at such a high environmental cost, putting us closer to Mexico's trap than to Singapore's success. And the point is not to follow Mexico's footsteps. So environmental economics can help fix this by changing the rules of the game. It says let's price pollution, let's tax carbon, let's make clean options profitable. So growth no longer means degradation. This is where environmental economics comes in. So carbon pricing, taxes, emissions trading schemes internalize these costs, shifting behavior and investments towards sustainability. Malaysia's upcoming carbon tax and carbon credit exchange could be the tipping point, and we are really keeping our fingers crossed for that. Next, let us look at Malaysia's biggest sustainability dilemmas, palm oil and forest. So, palm oil is a major economic driver for Malaysia. But between the year 2001 to 2017, it was also responsible for 68% of our total deforestation. And that's millions of hectares of forest gone for development, for economic growth. But this is where natural resources economics steps in. It raises questions like, are we using our natural capital wisely, which we have plenty of as a country, or are we cashing out the future just to grow faster today? Economists talk about hoteling rule, the idea that resources should be extracted at a pace that maximizes long-term value. But in Malaysia, it's often a free-for-all, clear land, plant oil palm, profit fast without accounting for biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, or the indigenous rights. However, there is hope. Policies like Malaysia's sustainable palm oil, MSPO certification, forest reserve enforcement, and payments for ecosystem services are nudging us in the right direction for natural resources economics. But unless we embrace this economic incentive into law and land use planning, we risk repeating past mistakes. And unlike palm oil, forests don't grow back quickly. Next, let's look at sustainable development economics. It reminds us that growth must be inclusive to be truly sustainable. In Malaysia, only about 55% of women are active in the labor force, despite often outperforming men in education. This gap represents not just a gender issue, but a massive loss of economic potential. Studies also show that closing the gender gap could boost Malaysia's GDP by up to 50 billion USD. Empowering women also improves social outcomes from household incomes to children's education and to environmental stewardship. As Amartya Sen said, true progress expands people's freedoms, not just output. Well, to be honest, to make big changes, we need funds. So this is where green finance comes in. Green finance is how we turn sustainability from an ideal into action. By directing funds into clean energy, transport, and eco-friendly development, we're not just reducing harm, we're also building a resilient economy. Malaysia's 2017 Green Sukuk marked a turning point for the country. Globally, ESG investments now top $35 trillion. So, when financial incentives support sustainability, we are no longer choosing between profit and planet. We are aligning them. So, let us look at the reality. When we look beyond GDP, we uncover a more painful truth. Rising numbers don't always mean rising well-being. As you can see that, as of last year, 2024, Malaysia reported a GDP of 5.1%. But look at the recent news that we gather online and more. They don't always point towards sustainability, better well-being, or people are happier. So in Malaysia, we just have not kept up with the productivity or the rising cost of living. In many urban poor, especially youth, are working harder than ever and still falling further behind. Progress shouldn't be measured by GDP alone, but by how it translates into dignity, fairness, and better lives for everyone. Now, why GDP fails? Actually, GDP did not fail. It was just never meant to measure human happiness, well-being, or planetary health. It can count oil spills as positive and ignore caregiving, inequality, or burnout. GDP can grow even when life quality falls or biodiversity declines. This is where it fails to measure. So it's time that we evolve and measure what truly matters. Instead of looking at just GDP, economics should also include the following, such as Human Development Index, Inclusive Wealth Index, Genuine Progress Indicator, and Catch-up Index, as we previously discussed about. Coming to the end of my presentation, I would like to conclude that GDP itself is just a number. The number alone cannot define the national's progress. True development requires equity, sustainability, and well-being of the planet and the people. So environmental limits and social needs must guide economic decisions by policymakers. And I would like to say thank you for staying with me up to this point of my presentation. So let's be the generation that measure what truly matters and leave behind a world that we are proud of. And thank you so much for your time today.